revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? lit. The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Yeshitela, Director of Membership in the National Office of Recruitment and Membership for the African People's Socialist Party, and I'll be your MC for this morning. Today's study comes from the political report to the APSP's 7th Congress, Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, Chapter 4, titled The Deepening Crisis of Imperialism, the Tipping Point of the Uneasy Equilibrium. You can follow along with the document linked in the Facebook/YouTube description. This political report serves as a means to define what we see in the world and how it is we've gotten to this point. It provides the sharpest analysis of imperialism in crisis and lays out what it will take to deepen it for the benefit of our revolution. As said many times by our party, the crisis of imperialism need not be our crisis. There is nothing to mourn about the death of a dying capitalist colonialist system that has come into existence through the enslavement of Africa and her people for the past 600 years. This chapter will help us to understand how this crisis manifests out into the world and how, with African internationalism, we can sum it up for ourselves. I am deeply honored to introduce the leader and founder of the African People's Socialist Party, the author of Vanguard, and the one who continues to accurately sum up the state of the world and our road to freedom, Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru. I want to thank Comrade Riverside for that introduction to this chapter. I thought it was a splendid introduction. Before moving forward, I really want to acknowledge that today is May 19th. And of course, for African people, May 19th has an extraordinary significance in that it is the birth date of Comrade Malcolm X, who more than any other force in recent history is responsible for the ideological direction of the African liberation movement here and in many places around the world. In fact, Malcolm X did affect the consciousness of oppressed peoples around the world. I just remember how even when the people in Iran seized the U.S. Embassy in 1979 in Tehran, the nest of spies as it was characterized, that many of the Africans, or the Africans who were in that embassy, were offered their freedom along with women because the Iranian people were sympathetic to the revolutionary or the plight and struggle of African people, and partially because of the influence of Malcolm X. And of course, there was an African a U.S.-born African who was in the embassy who refused to leave his white masters. But Malcolm was extraordinarily influential, and he has been referenced at different times by others from Iran in particular. It is also the anniversary of the birth of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh has been considered the father of what is characterized as the Vietnamese nation. He was the leading force that was responsible for the revolutionary struggle that first kicked the French out of Vietnam and then crushed the efforts of the United States government to maintain the enslavement of that proud people. And of course, the Vietnamese Revolution is one from which we have learned significantly. And I should also mention that the Vietnamese Revolution also had some influence by the African Revolution in this country, in that Ho Chi Minh, whose birth anniversary is today, is somebody who also attended meetings of Marcus Garvey in Harlem, New York, and was considered by the government and by some others as to have been Garvey's representative in that area of the world. And I have spoken to people who participated as mercenaries, Africans who were part of the U.S. military force who were fighting against the Vietnamese people, and they've all, many of them, spoken about how clear the Vietnamese were about the plight of African people in this country, and successfully were able to win many Africans who were there in the service of the United States government to a better stance, and actually how that played a major role in the victory of the Vietnamese people over U.S. imperialism. So I just wanted to acknowledge both, acknowledge the birth dates of Malcolm X and Ho Chi Minh, extraordinarily significant forces in the struggle against imperialist domination of Africans and other oppressed peoples around the world. Other thing I wanted to do is, and this was something that was begun by Comrade Reverside's introduction to this study, is just to remind us that this is not some kind of bland history discussion that we're having. I mean, that's one of the things, that's the fad of today. Many Africans, intellectuals and petty bourgeois forces who, as a consequence of the heroism of the African working class, and particularly in the last 5 years subsequent to the rebellion in Ferguson, Missouri, by the African, the working class young people, have discovered black history and African history, and everybody wants to talk about African history. And you can go on social media and find 1,000 discussions of some sort about African history, but this is not some empty discussion of history. It's not an effort by the African People's Socialist Party to recount the history of inventions and important dates in the struggle of African people. We are African internationalists, which means that our worldview is shaped and influenced by an analysis and investigation of history that is based on historical materialist analysis and investigation, a way of seeing the world and recognizing that when with the present that we're looking at today and that we are reporting on, that we are discussing today, is pregnant. And it has been made pregnant by its relationship with the past. So we're not just talking about looking at the past. We're talking about looking at the past from this place where we are located in the present. And the present is pregnant, and it's pregnant with the future. The future is before us. And I think it's really important. That's what we say when we say we engage in a contest between the past and the future. It is a relationship that the present has with the past that has impregnated it with the future. Karl Marx liked to say that the society, every society, that violence rather is the midwife of every society pregnant with a new one. And the reason I'm bringing up both these things, as I say, Marx's statement and assessment of the role of violence and what we're saying about how today is the present is pregnant with the future, made pregnant with the future by the past, is how we interpret the world. That's an historical materialist assessment that gives us the ability to do that. And one thing that we're saying is that history is not ours to use as we would, or to experience as we would, especially if we're talking about revolutionaries. And if we're talking about revolutionaries who are part of a revolutionary organization that has assumed its responsibility and its mission to create a new world, to overturn a social system that as a condition of its existence requires the misery, the exploitation, the horrible brutality imposed on most of the peoples of the world. If that's what we are talking about, and that's what the African People's Socialist Party is about, and to the extent that we've been successful with these studies and other processes that we've initiated to create real cadre, real revolutionaries, if that's what we are about, then we recognize that history is not something that we experience and simply do so on our own terms, and we just record it and move forward. That there are constantly, or there are frequently times when doors and windows are open for brief periods of time, that we have to seize those times and move through those doors and move through those windows, at least if we are going to be successful within the period of time that we are discussing and trying to make this revolution. We are trying to make a revolution. And the African People's Socialist Party is the vehicle through which this revolution has to be made. If you're talking about making a revolution, you must be also talking at the same time about how to do it. There must be some vehicle through which the people can not only find relief, but can participate in the process that overturns a system that is born through the horrible violence, oppression, enslavement of humanity, and that can only see a change, a future, see itself in control of the future through revolution. So that's why we participate in a party, a revolutionary party. And that's why we're going through today's study. It is, as has already been mentioned, from the Seventh Congress of the African People's Socialist Party, and it is chapter 4. The Seventh Congress political report has been titled Vanguard, the Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution. And this chapter talks about the deepening crisis of imperialism. And this crisis is something that's rather obvious, and if we know how to see it. Some people won't see it this way. Some people saw, for example, the victory, the electoral victory, so to speak, of Barack Hussein Obama almost as the end of history. There are some people who are Africans who call themselves progressives and revolutionaries and so-called black leftists. And for some, it was an extraordinary disaster. For some others, it meant that an opportunity now for African people to somehow succeed within the existing social system. Both of these assessments were totally wrong. Because if you look at what's happening today, we see greater activity subsequent by the African masses or by people in general subsequent to the selection of Barack Hussein Obama than we had seen for 2 generations prior to that occurrence. And it's not because Barack Obama brought us some form of progress, but it's because that it was one of the last gasps of imperialism, because it was representative of imperialism in crisis. Who in the hell would ever have thought that the system would have reached a point that it would have to elevate a Negro and make it the president of the United States? And not only just any African, they didn't nominate a Jesse or Al or somebody like that, somebody like Barack Hussein Obama. What an extraordinary turn of events. And so some people were really dismayed and distraught and saw this as being the end of history. But we recognized that it was a statement of the crisis of imperialism, that they had to do this and that they couldn't do a Jefferson, they couldn't do an Al, and that they had to create this person. Obama was a creation of white power and put this person forward, and they had to have Hussein in this country while they were killing Husseins in other parts of the world, and they had to have an Obama in this country while they were trying to suppress the struggle of African people in other places around the world and inside this country as well. So it was not a statement of some great achievement of imperialism. It was a statement of crisis that many of them could not see. We saw it. And so we want to say that we have to know what it is that we're looking at today and how it is that we take advantage of this window that is open for the revolution at this particular time. So having said that, I want to go ahead and move us forward with this study, and I'm starting on page 117, chapter 4, The Deepening Crisis of Imperialism. And the subheading on that is the tipping point of the uneasy equilibrium. The unending wars waged by the U.S. from one end of the earth to the other are evidence of the crisis of imperialism. Perhaps the greatest example of the imperialist crisis today, however, can be found in the White House, the seat of U.S. government power. Every day there is a new scandal associated with the regime of U.S. President Donald Trump. A host of explanations is being advanced by the thinking representatives of the white ruling class for why the Trump administration continues to be embroiled in crippling controversy. The struggle being waged against this regime, against his regime by other sectors of the white ruling class is extraordinary. And I should say the open struggle. The Trump regime is not fundamentally different from the Obama regime that preceded it. It is certainly not a departure from the predatory colonial capitalist campaign of Hillary Clinton. His 2016 Democratic Party opponent, whose loss to Trump sent shockwaves through the white ruling class elite. We have said all along that the electoral process is simply a vehicle for nonviolent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. We have said all along that the electoral process, the one that the Democrats are clamoring is so precious to of what they call our democracy and the American way of life that's been undermined by some unseemly deal between the Russians and Trump administration. We have said all along that this electoral process is simply a vehicle for non-violent struggle by contending sectors of the colonial capitalist ruling class for control of the state for their own profit-making advantage. Nothing clarifies this fact more than the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign and Trump's election. The state is an organ, I'm mentioning the state here because we're saying that this nonviolent contest between sectors of the bourgeoisie that happens in the electoral process is a contest that they're engaged in for control of the state. That's what it is. To their own profit-making advantage. The state is the organ of coercion utilized by the ruling class to protect the system of colonial capitalism. It is clearly the police, courts, jails, and other repressive institutions. It is also the military and the various intelligence components associated with it. The state is the FBI, CIA, NSA, and the assorted secret police agencies about which most people know nothing. The state has existed since society split into irreconcilable classes. And by the way, I say that most people know nothing about it, but Africans have an understanding about this enemy here that creates problems for the bourgeoisie all the time in the United States. And that's why, for example, the state of in St. Louis, in Missouri, where there is a law, an ordinance that prohibits hiring anybody for the city to work for the city outside of the city limits. It prohibits that. But now the government is, and the white ruling class, I should say, and sectors of the existing government are working overtime to change that ordinance so that they can now begin to hire police from outside of St. Louis to come and work inside St. Louis. In other words, they want to hire some white people to come and be formally in part of a military oppression, exploitation, and control and containment of the African population. Why? Two reasons. One, because they can't trust Africans. They can't trust the oppressed in any deep situation, especially when the oppressed are the majority and have the ability to be influenced by their cousins, their sisters and brothers, their uncles, their aunts, and their neighbors. So they can't trust those Africans. And also, it is important to them because of the relationship that Africans have with the state, make black people in the United States less inclined to join the police department than anybody else. And so you hear these arguments being made by representatives of the bourgeoisie, the white ruling class, and its minions inside of the city of St. Louis, that they have to be able to hire cops from outside of St. Louis because they cannot meet their quota with people inside St. Louis. And the question should be for everybody, why is it that the African population refused to join the police department in the city of St. Louis? What is there about this relationship that would prohibit or discourage Africans from joining? They don't ask that question. Something must be wrong with the Africans who live here and not the relationship that has imposed on the Africans who live here by this organization of the state. So we say that the state has existed since society split into irreconcilable classes, into groups locked into a relationship of the exploited and the exploiters. Here we're looking at the origin of the state, where the exploiters lived at the expense of the others. In this city of St. Louis, to just give it an immediate and oversimplified example, is characterized by the relationship between between people who live north of what they call the Delmar Divide and south of the Delmar Divide. North of the Delmar Divide, where the Africans live there, it's imposed nothing but poverty, desolation almost, ongoing deterioration of the housing stock, the work to try to take all the housing stock. The government has now has a bank where they control all the housing stock that is no longer, people are no longer capable to hold on to them in the African community. That's the bank. And that bank has this created rules and regulations that you can get the houses stock here, but you have to be able to meet certain kind of requirements that ordinary Africans cannot possibly meet. We have a relationship where the exploiters and the exploited. And on the south side of Delmar Divide, where most of the white people live, you see wealth, you see resources, you see sidewalk cafes, you see all a variety of food and restaurants and all that stuff on the south side. On the north side, you see poverty. And the wealth on the south side is directly related to the poverty on the north side. So as long as you have this kind of relationship, then you have to have the state. In fact, every instance where there has been some kind of uprising in the city of St. Louis, you hear them first deploying the state, the police, and what have you at the Delmar Divide to make sure that it does not cross over to the south side where the majority of the white people and all the wealth is located. So the state is older than the United States. In ancient Rome and Greece, the state protected the interests of the slave owners over the slaves. In feudal Europe, it upheld the interests of the nobility over the peasants and the serfs. The European imperialist invasion of Africa, Asia, and the lands now known as the Americas created a new capitalist state, a capitalist social system. Now the state was no longer simply an instrument of coercion directed at protecting and maintaining the power of a social system within the boundaries of specific European territories. You see, now with the emergence of capitalism, this the European imperialist invasion of Africa, Asia, and the lands now known as the Americas created a new capitalist social system. It's a different social system for Europe. And that means it's a different social system for the rest of the world, because now the rest of the world is dominated by Europe through slavery and colonialism. And that sets the terms that every human being on the planet Earth now has the relationship that we have with each other and that we have with what has now come to be known as imperialist white power. So the capitalist state created structures that protected and projected the interests of the bourgeoisie in faraway places. This was a bourgeoisie made possible by the primary features of what Karl Marx termed the primitive accumulation of capital, the genesis of the capitalist system itself. The capitalist state was a consequence of Europe's imperialist assault on Africa and the rest of the peoples of the world. It has always had a global capacity flowing from its parasitic and predatory origin. Contrary to the notion that globalization is a new historic phenomenon, capitalism was born as a world system. The capitalist state is an international state power. Without bourgeois elections, the ruling elites would be reduced to fielding their own private armies to advance their interests. Without the bourgeois elections, each of them, you had 27 people, for example, contending for U.S. presidency in 1917. Without bourgeois election, every one of them representing a particular kind of capital, the bourgeoisie would have had its own armies out there fighting for control of the resources of the world, but now with this bourgeois elections, they can have a nonviolent contest among themselves for control of the state apparatus, of a single state apparatus to their own profit-making advantage. Okay? They would be nothing more than the warlords that we see in some countries that have not achieved developed the slavery-funded sophistication of bourgeois democracy, most often found in European countries. The bourgeois electoral process was designed to protect the colonial capitalist system from destruction by internecine war between capitalist predators competing for resources and markets. So the electoral process was created as a means by which they could avoid the war among each other that are competing for the resources and markets of the world. In this way, the electoral process functions as a component of colonial capitalist state power. That's what the elections are. I mean, I don't care if you're green or if you're red. I don't care if you're red, black, and green. The elections were not established for the benefit of us achieving power. It was established as a means by which the electoral process, by which the state is protected from the possibility of forces fighting for control of the state and the apparatuses there. That's what the electoral process is about. So it was not constructed with the intent or the assumptions that Africans and other people would be participating in this process. It is an assumption that white people, white leaders, white bourgeoisie would be the primary forces that are contending for control of the state. Okay. So obviously they didn't do it thinking that the colonial subjects would be involved in the struggle for control of state power. That's crazy. It's like the slave master during legal slavery would open up a system in the plantations where the slaves, the ones who they enslave, the ones who are responsible for every resource they have, the ones whose oppression is necessary for the gross exploitation that feeds them and their progeny, it's like they would set up a system where the ones who are being exploited and oppressed to feed them could have a vote on whether or not they're going to be exploited and oppressed and feed the white man. That's crazy. And the same thing is true when you look at the existing social system and the setup that they have. They did not set up anything that was assumed, that there was an assumption that the slave and the colonizer would have any say in how this world is going to be run and what was going to happen within the social system, or if the continuing social system would exist. What conscious slave would be involved in a system or a process that would somehow be based on finding improvement for ourselves within the system that enslaves us? That's crazy. The slave and the colonized are looking for processes through which we can overturn the system of slavery, kill the slave master, destroy the system of slavery, not trying to find a better life within slavery, right? That's like working for legal breaks in the slave system. You know, you get make sure that you get 15-minute breaks or lunch breaks and stuff like that, or vacations under slavery. And when the problem is slavery itself, right? The 2016 U.S. presidential election was also a white ruling class contest for control of the colonial capitalist state. It was a contest that was clothed in bourgeois idealism, designed to obscure the intention and interests of the minority white ruling class in order to win mass support from white people. The ability of the white masses to vote for their ruling class masters shrouds the dictatorship of the white ruling class, of the white rulers. The ability of the white masses to vote for their ruling class masters shrouds the dictatorship of the white rulers. This ability to vote has come to define democracy in the U.S. And for much of the white capitalist-dominated world. So if you can vote, it's democratic. They could vote in South Africa. It didn't matter that the vast majority of the African people lived like pigs and dogs and that were being bestialized and starved to death. They could vote in this country. It didn't matter that Africans being lynched and killed and even today being shot down in the streets because you got a democracy, because people can vote. And the same thing is true in this place that they call Israel, this occupied state, this white nationalist settler state that's stolen the land and territory of the Palestinian people. They can vote, and that's a democracy as compared to other places where people do not vote, right? The 2016 U.S. presidential election was a clear indicator of the growth of the crisis of imperialism. The fact that there were 17 Republican contenders for the nomination of their party and 6 major contenders for the Democratic Party nomination, a total of 23 altogether, reveal a fractured white ruling class incapable of choosing a popular representative of its splintered economic interests. The campaign occurred in a world that is being defined by the struggles of oppressed peoples whose subjugation is a condition for the success of the overall parasitic capitalist project. While U.S. politicians put their political programs forward as determinants of world history, all the presidential contenders were being driven by imperialist crisis that continues to threaten the stability and existence of colonial capitalism. So every one of them put forth their own basis for what it was they were running in their programs. What we are saying right now is every program of everyone contending for that election was informed by the imperialist crisis that continues to threaten the stability and existence of colonial capitalism today. Trump breaks up Atlantic Bloc. This is a really important aspect of this discussion in terms of understanding what some of the phenomenon that we're seeing, because people see the Trump and people, see like voting against Trump and fighting against Trump and Trumpism, et cetera, as the what everything is all about. So even some so-called revolutionaries and black leftists continue to tell us about how we have to defeat Trump because that's the essence of fascism or neo-fascism or proto-fascism, something to that effect. And that would have us defining what our relationship is to the system by the crisis of the system itself. And Trump is a manifestation of a system in crisis. So what is the difference between a Trump presidency in terms of Africans and the oppressed of the world and an Obama presidency? What is the difference between a democratic colonialism and a fascist colonialism? Colonialism is a defining feature, defining relationship that we experience with capitalist white power. It is colonialism. It is, what is the difference for African people when Germany was living under fascism? What the hell did that mean to the Africans who were living in Africa who were occupied by Germany? Or when Italy was living under fascism, what relationship did that have to colonial domination in Ethiopia and Eritrea and what have you? The fact is that African and the whole world system is organized under a capitalism that rests upon a foundation of a colonization of Africans and other oppressed peoples around the world. That is the critical question. And yes, from time to time, the system gets into serious kinds of distress that people now often refer to as fascism. And why do they call it fascism? They call it fascism. That's a name that they came up with, but they are defining something that has occurred when the dictatorship of capital expresses itself openly in the white world and to white people, to the colonizer, to the oppressor nation. Because the reality is the dictatorship of white power, of colonial capitalism expresses itself every day in the black world. I mean, why was Mike Brown, what was he? Was that democracy? Was that some expression of democracy? But it doesn't happen in the white world daily. If it would happen in the white world daily, then that would have been the fascism. But fascism is not fascism if it's attacking black people, and of course that's right, it's colonialism. It is the thing that the whole system rests upon, and so somehow destabilization of the system leads to a cannibalization inside the imperial powers themselves, among the colonizers. So the colonizer begins to devour its own. I think there's some animal, I can't remember if a fox or a wolf or something, when crowded and challenged in a serious way, the animal eats its own young. And I think that's what we're looking at when we're looking at this thing that they want to refer to as fascism, when the system turns inwardly and is able to reveal its fangs to sectors of the white ruling class. And Africans who see the world through the lenses of white people and white power will also be afraid of fascism, even as colonialism is devouring us in the streets every day, shutting out our communities, pushing us out of our communities, killing our children on the streets and destroying whatever, even the colonial educational process we were supposed to be involved in. Now, Trump is fascist. But before Trump, they closed 54 schools in Chicago under democratic colonialism. And they were shooting Africans here in St. Louis and other places under democratic colonialism. And they have missions all over the continent of Africa, and the U.S. military forces under Obama, democratic colonialism, imperialism, sent troops and have wars are being fought in Africa today. Nobody's even talking about them by the U.S. government. That's not fascism. It's not fascism until it affects white people or threatens to affect white people. And then those of us who see the world through the lenses of white people are screaming, fascism, fascism, fascism. And as long as you concentrate on fascism, what do? You're solving the problems of one sector of the white population versus another sector of the white population, and the colonial domination of African people continues forever. Anyway, so I went off on a tangent there. But you know what I mean, right? So Trump breaks up Atlantic Bloc. In the political report to our 2016 plenary, we spoke of this crisis through the voice of one of the leading imperialist thinkers of the time. Zbigniew Brzezinski recognized the crisis of imperialism for years. I'm saying his name wrong. It's, because the white people call him Big. Did call him, so it's something Zbigniew Brzezinski. Or the white people call his name wrong. In his 2007 book, Second Chance, The Presidents and the Crisis of American Superpower, this is 2007, Brzezinski proved prescient in his explanation of the ruling class split into a myriad of self-serving components, fighting for shares in an imperialist past shrunken by the world's peoples desperately struggling to take back their lives and resources from a blood-drenched imperialism. Says Brzezinski, and we quote here, global political awakening. See that? He says global political awakening. I think it's really important to understand that while you got Negroes here, you know, who are running around being black leftists and all of that and thinking that the contradiction is somehow centered and concentrated just here, global political awakening is historically anti-imperial, politically anti-Western, and emotionally increasingly anti-American. In the process, it is setting in motion a major shift in the global center of gravity. That in turn is altering the global distribution of power with major implications for America's role in the world. You see that? This global shift in the center of gravity that's coming about as a consequence of a global political awakening. The foremost geopolitical effect of global political awakening is the demise of the imperial age. Empires have existed throughout history, and in recent times, American paramountcy has often been described as a new global empire. The contenders for the presidency during the 2016 elections were confronted by the reality described here by Brzezinski. They represented different sectors of the white ruling class. As Trump declared, at every opportunity they were hirelings of big money. Their individual political programs advanced during the campaign represented the different positions of their big-moneyed employers who needed control of the U.S. state to realize their aims. But despite the fact that individual blocks of capital always fight to advance their own interests and were doing so in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, they have usually struggled within a generally agreed upon framework. Since the mid-1940s, when the U.S. and much of Europe coalesced around a general strategy to counter the growing influence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. took the lead in creating what became known as the Atlantic Bloc, whose proponents are known as Atlanticists. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was the most obvious political and military manifestation of the Atlantic Bloc. It also involved economic and security components that bound the liberal anti-communist white rulers into a common strategic trajectory for world domination. And I should mention here that another thing that happened during this process or was created was the so-called Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was named for U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall, who before he became Secretary of State was a general, General George Marshall. And the Marshall Plan was something that had the U.S. pumping billions, would have been amount to in today's money, would have amounted to $100 billion into Europe in particular. Some of it went to other places, but primarily into Europe. And it was a means by which they wanted to shore up Europe and save the capitalist system and to shore up Europe in opposition to the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, which presented itself to the world as the leadership of an international world struggle for the liberation or for the destruction of capitalism and for putting power into the hands of the working class of the world. And so the U.S. became the primary force to help block that. And part of the Atlanticist bloc was the creation of the Marshall Plan. That spent all this money in Europe and made factories happen and business happen, and the rest of it. It certainly contributed to all of that. And also, by the way, and some people in Europe were complaining, turned much of Europe into colonies of the United States government of the United States. U.S. leadership through the Atlantic Bloc included the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the United Nations, and an assortment of other related institutions, including international trade and economic bodies. And I'm talking about all of this, but you can see all of this being discussed today, and with the Trump administration and the trade relations and NATO and United Nations, and all of this stuff is up in the air and being debated. Also, a part of this bloc was an international court system that obeyed U.S. edicts, although the U.S. refused to recognize its authority as applicable to itself. An example of rule without regard for law, otherwise known as dictatorship. United Nations inherited the role previously assumed by the League of Nations, another U.S. brainchild that failed to win support within U.S. ruling circles after being advanced by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson following the First Imperialist World War. This role was as unifier, talking about the United Nations, as unifier and peacekeeper among predatory imperialist white powers that have historically gone to war over divisions of the colonial capitalist spoils among themselves. That's the first imperialist war was a struggle to redivide the world among capitalist predators. I don't care however else they were characterized. People now have assumed that the narrative of the victors in that war is the correct narrative, but it was a contest between contending bandits for control of the world. When we say redivision of the world, we're talking about the colonized world, because all of them relied on free and cheap labor and territory stolen from Africa, Asia, and what we now call the Americas. And then that was the first war. And then after that, that war was ended with the Treaty of Versailles, named for where the treaty was signed in the place in France. And that war took from Germany a lot of its colonies and other territory that many people, or some historians credit with inflaming the German passion for change and overturning this relationship that allowed Hitler to come to power. Hitler, Deutschland über alles, Germany over all, over everything. That was Hitler's slogan. And so then they had the second imperialist. And so out of that first imperialist war, Woodrow Wilson, who was U.S. president, had pushed for the creation of the League of Nations. This would become the dominant world parliamentary organization through which white powers would settle their disputes over who was going to control what. This is the time when they were debating this, that Garvey stepped forward when they were splitting up Africa among themselves. Garvey stepped forward and said, Africa for Africans at home and abroad. This was the basis of it. Right there, the Versailles Treaty and the struggle that was happening in the League of Nations was how they were concretizing what they were going to do with the rest of us. And so, I mean, you go to school here and they teach you about the First World War. I've never heard anything that made sense that they told me in school. A prince got assassinated in some place and therefore for World War. It never made any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to anybody. But there was this struggle to redivide the world, and then they come out of here with this League of Nations. So he said, look, we don't have to kill each other over these Negroes anymore. Let's sit down at a table. Let's come to an agreement, just like we did in Berlin in 1884 and 85. And this is how we'll solve the problem of who's going to get what. And so we said that this role was as unifier and peacekeeper among predatory imperialist white power. And you know, the United Nations is spoken of today as this organization for peace. That's one of the main features that they talk about. And it was an organization for peace, but it was for white peace. It was peace among white people over who was going to dominate the rest of the world. That's why it was organized in the fashion it's organized now, with the primary forces who had the ability to negate or to, what do you call it, when veto any action. One of 4 or 5, and I've forgotten who they were at the time, but they were white powers, had the ability to veto anything that was going to happen. You had the General Assembly where everybody could talk. Everybody could talk, could make speeches and what have you, but the big decision was going to be made by what? What's the name of the entity in the United Nations? Security Council. The Security Council. made all of the big decisions. They let the masses just talk your butts off. But the Security Council was the entity, and it gave this facade of democracy, just like what we're experiencing in most of the world today. You have a facade of democracy where a handful of powers, a handful of resources are making the fundamental decisions for the rest of the peoples of the world. So we said this role as unifier and peacekeeper among predatory imperialist white powers that have historically gone to war over divisions of the colonial capitalist spoils among themselves. Like the League of Nations, the United Nations was to function as a supranational agency that assured peaceful, nonviolent European control of the world's oppressed, colonized peoples. That's what the United Nations was created for. The only time it seemed to have been different was immediately after the struggles for independence you saw happening in the 1960s. You see these newly independent countries coming to the fore and then making speeches and talking about anti-colonialism, and some of them being radicalized by that process. And that shook up the United Nations for a while. But it didn't take the United States and other imperial powers too long to crush and kill those people who were trying to participate in the United Nations from these so-called independent countries and to keep them out. They overthrew Lumumba. They overthrew and killed Lumumba. They overthrew and killed Nkrumah. They were overthrowing and assassinating leaders all around the world that gave some kind of vitality momentarily to the United Nations that made it look feasible. Malcolm X was promoting people going to the United Nations because this was a heady moment of independence, struggles for independence that was happening throughout the world. But it did not take too long for the imperialists to destroy that. So the entire Atlanticist arrangement was designed to advance the interests of capitalists. And I'm trying to see, we're not going to finish this. Y'all know this. But I'm hoping that I can excite your imagination. I'm hoping that people will want to read this and understand this, because you can't understand a damn thing. I mean, up to now, even people should be informed a little bit about what the hell is happening with Trump and why people are so upset with Trump, even among the bourgeoisie. And not just what's happening in Trump, because it makes itself, Trumpism is happening in various places throughout Europe. And, you got Brexit. You got all these other kinds of Brexit. That is England now leaving the European Union. The European Union itself being threatened with instability and more countries trying to come out of it. Splits in Spain, Italy and France, and fighting each other over who's responsible for economic crisis based on the exploitation of Africa. I mean, this stuff is happening everywhere. And it would serve us to really look at this chapter to understand it, because people are coming into the movie late. And they're coming into the movie at the time where Trump gets elected, and that's the beginning of history for them. And they see imperialism acting a certain way, and for them it's because of Trump. But what we are saying here is that the present has been made pregnant with the future by the past. The future is being born through this relationship between the present and the past. And for most of us, it's been an illicit relationship. Most of us has been a consequence of having been raped. And depending on how we understand this and how we take this on, we will either abort the revolutionary period that we are approaching, or we will give birth to the new society that Karl Marx has said is only possible through the midwife known as violence. So violence is running for 5th district in St. Petersburg, Florida. Anyway, Uhuru. So the entire Atlanticist arrangement, is that where I am? Was designed to advance the interests of capitalists and the capitalist system by containing Soviet Russia. Another goal was to smother Germany's historical proclivity for violent domination of Europe that had resulted in the 2 previous imperialist wars to divide the world. The Atlantic Bloc was created to ensure peaceful, white, collaborative domination of the colonized peoples upon whose exploitation the entire parasitic capitalist order depended. For some time now, the Atlanticist arrangement has been fraying. The decline of the Atlantic Bloc was hastened by the 1991 collapse of Soviet Russia, whose existence was the impetus for its founding and the invention of the imperialist Cold War. U.S. collaboration with Europe and on most questions now became increasingly unnecessary since the U.S. no longer had to compete for European loyalty with a now severely crippled post-Soviet Russia. And here what we're talking about is, as I mentioned earlier, U.S. Marshall Plan that pumped all kinds of resources into Europe, not just Europe, immediately into Europe, but subsequently they helped to prop up and what they call South Korea and other places as part of the contest with communism to show the advantages of the bourgeoisie, of the bosses running everything as opposed to the workers coming to power. And that's one of the insidious, understated attacks that's being made even by the U.S. against Venezuela, against Korea, et cetera, because they're not white. And it's already understood that if you're white, non-white people, or people who are not white, are the workers and those who do all the dirty work, and then out there they think they're going to run things on their own, or they're going to take over resources that's previously fed white babies. And it's easy to move whites in much of the world, unfortunately, in aggression against them because of that understanding of the world that has been imposed on us by imperialist white power. So U.S. collaboration with Europe on most questions now became increasingly unnecessary since the U.S. no longer had to compete for European loyalty with a now severely crippled post-Soviet Russia. And the Soviet Union, and they always refer to the Soviet Union as Russia, was severely destabilized and ran into a serious economic crisis, as it had to, because there is no such thing as socialism where capitalism is a world dominant economy. You can't have socialism like that. And capitalism rests upon a domination of the rest of the world. And this proves African internationalism more than anything else, because in the Soviet Union, the real struggle by the workers under the Bolshevik Party led a revolution in what was Russia. And they took power, even though they were surrounded and invaded by all imperialist powers, including the United States, to keep them from coming to power. They took power in Russia. And then they were cut off, they put an economic quarantine on Russia. Russia did not have the advantage of colonialism in Africa, colonialism in the Americas, and colonialism in Asia and what have you. That was white power imperialism. That was what they call the West, where that's what kept the West afloat. That's what kept them having a lucrative situation, because they had slaves everywhere, and Russia didn't have slaves everywhere, and the United States and the rest of white power were determined not to allow them to share in any of the trade or any other thing that they were getting. They called it trade. It's looting. There's no such thing really in trade as looting that the imperialist powers have done. And so it didn't take too long before the so-called Russian Revolution to run into its limitation. Couldn't go any further. It was able initially, the peasants got power that they never had before. The peasants now could go to school. They couldn't go to before. Workers could now become doctors. They couldn't do that before. They could go to school, get education, and then they took the lands of the landlords and shared it out among the peasants. So that brought some immediate resource to the masses in Russia. But after that, what? And they were cut off from the rest of the world, and that in terms of the colonial empires of the world. And so that led, in a relatively short period of time to the collapse of the Soviet economy and the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now you have a Russia that is a capitalist Russia, but is still having a problem because it is in contention with the other capitalists and the order that the other capitalists have established for themselves for dominating the rest of the world. And the trajectory that they had started to dominate the world meant containing Russia. Even though it was Soviet Russia, it's still containing Russia. And they offered Russia an entree. They said, Russia and China, you can join us, but here are the terms that we are going to dominate. And now you have leadership in Russia and China who says that even though we are capitalists, we are not going to come in on your terms. In fact, China says, hey, we can do better than you. We can become better imperialists, better capitalists, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is part of the contest we're looking at. Okay. With the Soviet Union gone, Russia was no longer an ideological and economic contender in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and other regions of the world. And what had been considered a bipolar world had suddenly become a unipolar world, and with U.S. imperialism unquestionably at the helm. But all this changed. Lenin's declaration that the capitalists would sell somebody the rope to hang him with was realized by the mad rush by all the European capitalists to take advantage of a presumed hapless China. China underdeveloped, China with more than 1 billion people. They used to have a saying, if you just sold every Chinese a yard of fabric, what a gross profit, what a huge profit that would make. Let's go to China and get rich. And they all rushed into China. But China set the terms. China had made a Chinese revolution that turned out to be controlled by the nationalists, by the capitalists inside China, who were part of the Communist Party. China was not prepared, and China employed some of the same tactics in the economic field that Mao Zedong had talked about in guerrilla warfare. China opened up the door to some extent to let them in, and that's what you want to do. You want to have a powerful enemy, and you want to crush that powerful enemy. That's what I'm saying. Once we unite Africa under African Socialist International, let the imperialists in and then shut the door. Shut the door on them now. Say, get out of here if you can. You understand? And then you can crush them from side to side. And China let them in. China took their resources. China has built a major, in a short period of time, just major advances economically, industrially, and what have you in China at the expense of the rest of the capitalist world. Say, be careful what you wish for. The capitalists invaded with the intention of capturing the more than 1 billion Chinese as a lucrative market. To the dismay of the European and U.S. capitalists, China instead became a major economic and political power whose success had come at the expense of the absolute hegemony of the U.S. and European capitalism in general. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that Soviet opportunism could no longer exert influence over the struggles of the oppressed. And what I mean by that is that, especially after the death of Lenin, which happened in 1924, and this ongoing war against the Soviet Union, even the Second Imperialist World War, Churchill and Roosevelt and the others worked, de Gaulle and the others, they worked to try and let the Soviet Union capture the brunt of their war with Germany, to wear the Soviet Union out, to help destroy the Soviet Union and the Nazis. That was part of their strategy to do that. And what had happened is the Soviets had developed over a period of time this whole political line that the defense of the Soviet Union was the primary task of all progressives and communists and socialists in the world, defending the Soviet Union. And that meant at the expense of any struggle, the struggles in Africa, the struggles in the Americas, any place else, defense of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union would give resources, ideological, political, economic resources, and sometimes military resources to forces whose existence and practices contributed to the development and success of the Russia project, that is the Soviet Union itself. In other words, as opposed to communism and workers' solidarity being the primary basis for what these so-called communists were doing, now the national interest of the Russians, the Soviet Union, became the primary basis for the relationship that they had with the rest of the world. And because of this, the Soviet Union found itself through through the Communist International that Lenin organized in 1919. The Soviet Union found itself through the Communist International pushing these communist organizations around the world to move in a direction that facilitated the interests of the Soviet Union. That was the opportunism that's spoken of here. That was a form of opportunism. So that even sacrificed the struggle of oppressed and colonized peoples around the world. It sacrificed the whole struggle for communism in a certain way because it meant that as opposed to struggling against capitalism, our struggle is defined by what it would mean to the existing Soviet Union, or to what people refer to as Soviet Russia. I'm not going to complain if I muddle that and it's not clear to people. The collapse of the Soviet Union meant that Soviet opportunism could no longer exert influence over the struggles of the oppressed. Many groups that were stronger in the Middle East and other places because of Soviet support for struggles against the U.S. and imperialist white power lost their influence to indigenous movements with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This has unleashed massive anti-colonial resistance by Islamic-led movements fueled by poverty and repression by domestic U.S. and European puppet regimes, a history of European insults and humiliation, and deeply held memories of the European Christian crusades that provided a religious-based explanation for their struggle, for their oppression, for their exploitation. There's no little irony in the fact that the modern jihadist movement was organized, funded, and trained by the U.S. under the regime of U.S. President James Earl Carter. It was Carter's national security advisor, Brzezinski, who saw this as an anti-Soviet strategy to drain Soviet Russia economically by creating Russia's own Vietnam in Afghanistan, where there was a progressive Soviet-supported government in place. And the Vietnamese war, the struggle against the people of Vietnam, causes a real serious economic and political crisis inside the United States and for the United States, not just in the United States, but all around the world. The United States, this crisis. And so Brzezinski, the same guy we've quoted up to now, who was James Earl Carter. Carter was the U.S. president. He was his national security advisor. Brzezinski came up with the idea of getting these Islamic forces, these Muslims, and giving them training, military and even ideological training, organizational training, to go into Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union that was a supporter of a progressive government. I say it's progressive in the sense that it did all the stuff that they're talking about happened with women. They eradicated the opium fields so that all the dope and stuff that was coming out of Afghanistan, they really moved to transform the society in Afghanistan. And Brzezinski came with his program, Carter, with his program, created the modern jihad, the jihad movement that we're looking at now, the so-called Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, and all of these other forces have their origin in this strategy by the bourgeoisie, U.S. bourgeoisie, to send these forces into Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union and bog the Soviet Union down in this costly war, costly in terms of human and material resources, because the Soviets lost a lot of forces in there, and they also spent a lot of resources there. Okay, It was the folly of Carter and Brzezinski to think that in the minds of the jihadists, the U.S. white nationalist state would not also be seen as the imperialist infidel that had brought the Islamic world to its knees. It would not be long after the defeat of the Afghanistan government before the jihadists would also turn their guns on the U.S. Other imperialist powers and imperial craven demonic minions. This is what the CIA calls blowback. In other words, what goes round comes round. This method continues to be used repeatedly by the CIA. Colonialism, direct and indirect, which is the economic base of the global colonial capitalist system, was in a state of flux, along with all the reliant political and economic arrangements tethered to it. The cozy relationship U.S. President Trump appears to want with Russia, the open, near declaration of war with the G7 group that presumes to collectively control the world's economy, the rocky relationship with China that involves the move toward rapprochement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, they call it North Korea, and the ongoing internecine wars within ruling circles that stretch around the globe are evidence of a major shift in the political and economic alignments that have defined much of the world for the last 70 plus years of imperialist world domination. I hope everybody's riding with me on this one. The near absolute 500-year-old control of the world by the white man is on a shaky foundation that our party has described as an uneasy equilibrium. The dominant world colonial capitalist social system responsible for white wealth and security, and the brutal oppressive impoverishment of the rest of us, sits on the foundation of a profound, earth-shaking war between the colonial past and a post-colonial, increasingly visible, liberated future. The dominant world colonial capitalist social system responsible for white wealth and security, and the brutal, oppressive impoverishment of the rest of us, sits on the foundation of a profound, earth-shaking war between the colonial past and a post-colonial, increasingly visible, liberated future. Increasingly visible, liberated future. We of the African People's Socialist Party are contenders on the world stage. We of the African People's Socialist Party are contenders on the world stage. We are conscious, organized participants in the struggle of the oppressed and colonized. Our resistance is responsible for starving the bloated white nationalist colonial capitalist system to a point of desperate division. This has resulted in every white man for himself. Today, we see a scramble for new economic and political relations to stave off collapse of respective parasitic European economies within the shrinking system. Indeed, this is a crisis of imperialism. It is also a moment where the possibilities of a new imperial world war are greater than ever. Extremely significant economic interests are at stake. Bloodthirsty imperialist predators are willing and capable of mobilizing the oppressed of the world to fight other oppressed peoples to their collective extinction in the interest of protecting imperialism. They mobilize us to fight each other, the oppressed peoples around the world, to our own extinction. They don't have to put forces on the battleground. 71% of the people, soldiers fighting for France against the colonized people of Vietnam, were colonized people ourselves, Africans and others who lived under French colonialism fighting against the Vietnamese who were colonized by France. 50 to 65% of the soldiers on the front lines in the U.S. military fighting against Vietnam when the U.S. was trying to protect the French, protect the capitalist system. 50 to 65% of the troops on the front line were colonized black people from the United States. And that does not even speak to the other colonial subjects who lived in the United States or some of the U.S. colonial territories who wore U.S. uniforms to fight against the oppressed. They will have us killing each other. We had this recent discussion by somebody recently who was talking to us about how, from a military vantage point, the U.S. Somehow is losing ground to the people in Venezuela and to Russia and China and what have you, and as though that's our problem. Our problem is, as African, we are colonized people. We reject colonialism. We reject the whole system internationally, that the colonial system that has come into existence through slavery and colonialism. We see that what is happening in Venezuela has a direct and immediate implication for what's happening in Ferguson right now as we have this discussion. That we are fighting against the